The phone rang while I was unpacking the last of my boxes in my new apartment. 3 months after graduation, I was still settling into post-university life, trying to figure out what came next. Marine biology degrees from the University of Miami didn't exactly have employers beating down my door. "David Martinez speaking," I said, wedging the phone between my ear and shoulder as I continued emptying a box of books. "David, Thomas Richardson here." I nearly dropped the heavy oceanography textbook I was holding. Dr. Richardson had been my thesis advisor and mentor throughout my 4 years at Miami. I hadn't heard from him since the graduation ceremony. "Dr. Richardson, good to hear from you. How's everything going?" "Fine, David. Listen, I need to be direct. I have a proposition for you." His voice carried that familiar, measured tone I remembered from his lectures, precise and carefully controlled. I sat on the edge of my bed. "What kind of proposition?" "A research opportunity, North Atlantic, deep sea work." My heart rate picked up. Real field work was exactly what I needed to jumpstart my career. "I'm listening," I said. "It's a joint operation with Russian scientists, 6 weeks aboard their research vessel." He paused. "I should mention that aspects of the expedition are classified. I can't share many details until we're on site." That gave me pause. "Classified? What exactly would I be doing?" "Your expertise in deep-sea ecosystems would be valuable. Beyond that, I can only tell you we'll be conducting research approximately 700 nautical miles northwest of Murmansk. The Russians are leading the expedition, and they're quite particular about information security." I ran a hand through my hair, thinking. 6 weeks of mysterious deep-sea research didn't sound like something to jump into blindly. But this was Dr. Richardson, the man whose work on hydrothermal vent communities had inspired me to study marine biology in the first place. "Why me?" I asked. "Surely there are more qualified people." "You have the right combination of skills and adaptability, and frankly, you're available. Most researchers with your qualifications are tied up in ongoing projects." He cleared his throat. "The pay is excellent. $20,000 for 6 weeks, plus you'd be working alongside some of the top researchers in the field. $20,000 would clear my student loans and give me breathing room to find permanent work after we returned." "When would this start?" 2 weeks from today, you'd fly to Murmansk, all expenses covered, of course." The suddenness of it all made me uneasy, but the opportunity was too good to pass up. Deep-sea research was notoriously difficult to break into without connections or years of experience. "All right," I said after a moment. "I'm in." "Good. I'll email you the details. Pack for cold weather, David. Russian cold." After hanging up, I sat on my bed for a long time, staring at the wall. The whole conversation felt surreal. I knew I should be more cautious about joining a classified expedition with minimal information, but my curiosity about what might be waiting in the deep waters of the North Atlantic pushed those concerns aside. 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation, renewing my passport, getting recommended vaccinations, and packing cold weather gear I hadn't needed in Miami. Before I knew it, I was on a series of flights taking me progressively northward, Miami to New York to Oslo, Oslo to Murmansk. The descent into Murmansk was my first indication of just how different this world was from the sunny beaches of Florida. Through gaps in the clouds, I caught glimpses of a gray city surrounded by hills stripped bare of vegetation, with naval vessels dotting the harbor below. Even in late spring, patches of snow clung to shadowed areas. A driver holding a sign with my name met me at the small airport. He spoke no English but drove me directly to a hotel near the port where, according to my instructions, I was to meet Dr. Richardson and the rest of the American team. The hotel lobby was dimly lit and smelled of cigarettes despite the no-smoking signs. Dr. Richardson sat in a corner with 2 others, a woman with auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail and a bearded man scanning a document with intense focus. Richardson stood when he saw me. He looked older than I remembered. His hair had more gray and new lines creased his forehead. "David, good to see you. His handshake was firm. "Let me introduce you to our colleagues." The woman stood first. Rebecca Clark, marine biology with a focus on deep-sea adaptations. Her handshake was quick and professional. "Kevin Hayes," the bearded man said without looking up from his papers. "Geological research." I nodded to both of them. "David Martinez, deep-sea ecosystems." "Sit," Richardson said, gesturing to an empty chair. "We don't have much time before our Russian hosts arrive to escort us to the ship." "So, what exactly are we looking for out there?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Rebecca and Kevin exchanged glances. "We were hoping you'd know," Rebecca said. "We've all received the same limited briefing." Kevin finally looked up from his papers. "They've told us nothing beyond the duration and general area of operations." Richardson leaned forward. "The Russians are funding this entirely. It's their expedition, their ship, their rules. We're guests with specific expertise they've requested." "But you must know something," I pressed. "You're the one who recruited us." Richardson's expression didn't change. "I was asked to assemble a team with your specific skill sets. That's all I can say for now." Before I could ask more questions, the hotel door opened and two men in dark uniforms entered. They scanned the lobby before approaching our table. "Dr. Richardson," the taller one said with a thick accent. "Captain Petrov sends his regards. The vehicle is ready to transport you to RV Severny." We gathered our luggage and followed the men to a waiting van. The drive through Murmansk was short and silent. The city seemed drained of color. Concrete buildings, gray skies, and the steely water of the harbor in the distance. When we rounded the final bend toward the docks, I got my first look at the RV Severny, and my stomach tightened. This was no ordinary research vessel. The ship was massive, at least 300 feet long, with a reinforced hull and what looked like weapon mounts covered by tarps. The designation RV for research vessel seemed misleading. This looked more like a military ship that had been hastily disguised for scientific purposes. "That's our home for the next 6 weeks," Rebecca muttered beside me. Kevin let out a low whistle. "What kind of research requires that much firepower?" Richardson remained silent, his face unreadable as we approached the gangway where a line of uniformed crew members stood at attention. A tall man with short gray hair and the rigid posture of someone with military training stepped forward. "Welcome aboard RV Severny. I am Captain Alexander Petrov." His English was precise but heavily accented. "You will be shown to your quarters immediately. There will be a brief orientation at 1800 hours in the main laboratory. No handshakes, no pleasantries, just cold efficiency." The crew members behind him maintained expressionless faces, watching us with carefully neutral gazes. We were led through narrow corridors deep into the ship. The interior was as utilitarian as the exterior. Steel walls, exposed pipes, and the constant hum of machinery. My quarters turned out to be a small cabin with a narrow bunk, a tiny desk, and a shared bathroom with Kevin next door. The orientation that evening was brief and uninformative. Captain Petrov outlined restricted areas of the ship, which seemed to be most of it, and the daily schedule. When asked about our research objectives, he simply stated, "You will be briefed on specific tasks when we reach the designated coordinates." After the meeting, a crew member who introduced himself as James Wilson showed us the main laboratory where we would presumably be working. The equipment was state-of-the-art, but much of it remained packed away in crates marked with Cyrillic characters. "When will we know what we're actually doing out here?" I asked James as he demonstrated the lab's sonar system. He avoided my eyes. "Captain will explain everything when the time is right." As we returned to our quarters for the night, I felt the ship's engines rumble to life. Looking out the small porthole in my cabin, I watched the lights of Murmansk grow distant as we moved out into the harbor. Standing there, watching Russia's coastline fade into darkness, I felt a mixture of excitement and unease. Whatever waited for us in the depths of the North Atlantic, it was significant enough to justify this level of secrecy and security. My scientific curiosity was fully awakened. overriding the warning signals flashing in my mind. The ship pushed forward into open water, and I made a silent promise to myself. No matter what we found out there, I would document everything. After all, that's what scientists do. We observe, we record, we learn, even when the subject of our study is surrounded by mystery. Little did I know just how much I would regret that promise in the weeks to come. 3 weeks had passed since we'd left Murmansk, and I still had no idea what we were actually doing out here in the North Atlantic. The days blended together in a monotonous routine of basic research tasks: water sample analysis, temperature readings, standard oceanic current documentation, all busy work that any first-year graduate student could handle. The Russians maintained their wall of secrecy. We American scientists were allowed access to only 3 areas of the ship: our quarters, the small laboratory where we conducted our meaningless tests, and a section of the mess hall where we ate our meals separately from the Russian crew. Dr. Richardson had grown increasingly quiet as the days passed. When I tried to question him about our actual purpose, he would just shake his head slightly and mutter something about patience. Rebecca and Kevin had given up asking questions altogether, focusing instead on their assigned tasks with resigned professionalism. Armed guards stood at entrances to the restricted sections of the ship: the bridge, the communications room, and an entire lower deck that none of us had seen since boarding. I had tried once to walk down a corridor that led toward the ship's bow, only to be stopped by a stern-faced Russian sailor who pointed me back the way I came without saying a word. That night, our 22nd at sea, I lay in my narrow bunk reading a dog-eared paperback I'd brought along. The constant rumble of the engines had become white noise to me, the gentle rocking of the ship in the rough waters almost comforting in its predictability. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was airborne. My body slammed against the metal floor as the ship jerked to a violent halt. My back hit the edge of the small desk bolted to the wall, sending a spike of pain up my spine. The engines stopped completely. In their place came an eerie silence broken only by the sound of objects settling after being thrown about the cabin. My books scattered across the floor, toiletries from the small shelf now in the sink. I pulled myself up, disoriented and aching. What the hell had just happened? It felt like we'd hit something massive. But there had been no warning, no alarm. Had we struck an iceberg? A submerged wreck? I grabbed my jacket and yanked open my cabin door. The narrow hallway was dim, lit only by the emergency lighting. I expected to see other crew members rushing about, emergency protocols in action. Instead, the corridor was empty. I made my way toward the main deck, passing Kevin's cabin. His door remained closed. Either he'd slept through whatever had happened, which seemed impossible, or he was choosing not to investigate. The stairs to the upper deck were unguarded for once. I climbed them quickly, pushed open the heavy door, and stepped out into the cold night air. What I saw made no sense at all. The deck was fully lit. Russian crew members moved about their stations with calm efficiency. No one was running, no alarms blared, no emergency equipment had been deployed. The scene looked like any other night on watch, except for the fact that we were completely stationary in the middle of the North Atlantic. I spotted Captain Petrov near the starboard rail, talking quietly with 2 crew members. He looked up as I approached, his expression hardening. "Captain," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What happened? It felt like we hit something." Petrov's face remained impassive. "Nothing to concern yourself with, Mr. Martinez. A routine engine check." I stared at him. "Routine. We stopped so suddenly I was thrown out of my bunk. The sea is rough tonight. Perhaps you were not braced properly." His tone suggested the conversation was over, but I couldn't let it go. "Captain, with all due respect, that was not a normal stop. The whole ship shuddered. Did we hit something?" One of the other men said something in Russian, too low for me to hear. Petrov nodded slightly before turning back to me. "Mr. Martinez, you should return to your quarters. The weather will worsen soon. We will resume normal operations shortly." As if on cue, a security officer appeared at my elbow. Mikhail, the one who always watched us with particular suspicion. "I will escort you back," he said, his accent thicker than Petrov's. I wanted to resist, to demand answers, but something in Mikhail's expression told me it would be pointless. As he led me away, I looked back over my shoulder at the crew. Several men were gathered at the port side rail, looking down at the water. One held what looked like a spotlight, pointing it into the depths. Back in the restricted corridor, I noticed something else odd. A group of Russians carrying equipment I'd never seen before. They wore different uniforms than the regular crew, more like specialized dive gear, but modified for extreme cold. They disappeared through a door that had always been guarded before. Mikhail noticed my interest and stepped in front of me, blocking my view. "Your cabin is this way," he said firmly. When I reached my quarters, I didn't go inside immediately. I waited until Mikhail's footsteps faded, then quickly made my way to a small side passage that had a porthole. The glass was frosted with salt spray, but I could still see out. The ship had definitely changed position. The stars had shifted, and based on my limited navigational skills, we were now heading in a completely different direction than we had been earlier that day. We had turned almost 90 degrees, now moving northeast rather than northwest. I returned to my cabin, troubled by what I'd seen, or rather by what I hadn't seen. No damage, no emergency, no explanation that made any sense. Sleep was impossible. I lay awake, listening to the ship. After about an hour, the engines rumbled back to life, the vibration returning to the floor and walls. We were moving again, but in this new direction. Toward what? The rest of the night passed slowly. I strained to hear anything unusual. Voices in the corridor, equipment being moved, anything that might explain what had happened. But there was nothing except the normal sounds of a ship at sea. When morning came, I went to breakfast early, hoping to catch Dr. Richardson alone. He was already there, looking tired, a cup of coffee cooling in front of him. "Did you feel that stop last night?" I asked, keeping my voice low. He nodded slightly, not meeting my eyes. "Mechanical issues happen at sea." "That wasn't mechanical, and you know it," I said. "We've changed course." Richardson looked up then, his expression warning me to be careful. "David, focus on your work. That's what we're here for." Before I could press him further, Rebecca and Kevin arrived, both looking as tired as I felt. Kevin's eyes were bloodshot, suggesting he hadn't slept either. "Strange night," Kevin said casually as he sat down. Rebecca nodded. "Very." Nothing more was said. We ate in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. Through the small mess hall window, I could see the endless gray of the North Atlantic stretching to the horizon. Somewhere out there was our new destination. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had stopped us last night was the real reason we were out here, and whatever it was, the Russians had been prepared for it. I woke up early the next morning after a night of broken sleep. My back still ached from where I'd hit the desk when I was thrown from my bunk. When I pulled myself out of bed, the ship was moving steadily through moderate seas. I dressed quickly and headed toward the mess hall, hoping to catch Richardson again before the others arrived. No such luck. The small section where we Americans were allowed to eat was empty. I grabbed coffee and a piece of dry toast, not particularly hungry, but needing something in my stomach. Through the narrow window, I noticed unusual activity on the rear deck. Crewmen were moving with purpose, hauling equipment I hadn't seen before. After finishing my coffee, I made my way to the small observation area near the stern that we were permitted to access. What I saw stopped me in my tracks. The crew was unfolding and preparing what could only be described as a massive net system. This wasn't standard research equipment. The net stretched across the entire width of the stern, at least 200 feet across, with cables thicker than my wrist. Most striking were sections of the mesh that contained metal wiring and what looked like battery packs, attached at regular intervals. James Wilson, the marine technician who had shown us around the lab on our first day, was directing a team of 6 men as they checked connections and tested mechanical winches. I approached him, trying to look casual. "Morning, James. That's quite a setup." He glanced at me, then back to his clipboard. "Morning, Mr. Martinez. I've worked on research vessels before, but I've never seen a net this size. What are you collecting?" James shrugged. "Routine deep-sea specimen collection. Captain wants comprehensive samples from this region." His explanation made little sense. The net I was looking at wasn't designed for random sampling. It was built to catch something large. Very large. "Seems like a lot of equipment for routine collection," I pressed. "Russian methods," he said with finality, then turned away to bark orders at his team in broken Russian. I backed up to a spot where I could watch without being in the way. Over the next hour, I observed the methodical preparation of what was clearly a specialized capture operation. The winch systems alone must have cost millions. Heavy-duty hydraulics capable of lifting enormous weight from extreme depths. Rebecca appeared beside me, coffee mug in hand. "What's going on?" "Apparently, routine specimen collection," I said, making air quotes. She let out a low whistle as she took in the scale of the operation. "That's no routine anything." We watched together as the crew finished their preparations and began lowering the massive net into the water. The steel cables creaked under tension as the winches released them at a controlled pace. "Look at the sonar station," Rebecca murmured. On a raised platform above the main deck, Alexander Petrov stood with 3 men in white lab coats, Russians I hadn't seen before. They huddled around equipment that looked like advanced sonar displays, pointing at readings and speaking rapidly in Russian. Their intensity was palpable even from a distance. "They're tracking something specific," I said. Rebecca nodded. "And whatever it is, it's big." As the morning progressed, I found a pair of binoculars in the observation area and used them to watch the depth markers on the winch system. The net went down much deeper than any standard collection. 800 feet, 1,000, 1,500, eventually reaching nearly 2,000 feet below the surface. At that depth, the pressure was intense, the water near freezing, and the environment hostile to most life forms. Yet the Russians monitored their sonar with the focus of hunters who knew exactly what they were looking for. 2 armed guards now stood at the entrance to the deck area where the winch controls were located. Another patrolled the perimeter of the sonar station. The security had noticeably increased since the previous day. Kevin joined us around mid-morning, his expression grim. "They've closed off the lab. Said we won't be needed today." "Not needed?" Rebecca asked. "Then what are we here for?" "Window dressing," I suggested. "Whatever this expedition is really about, it's happening right now." At lunchtime, I returned to the mess hall, finding it mostly empty except for Dr. Richardson, who sat alone at our usual table. He looked up as I approached, his face drawn and tired. "You've been watching the net deployment," he said. It wasn't a question. I sat across from him. "Thomas, what are they hunting?" He glanced around the empty mess hall before speaking. "David, listen carefully. Stop asking questions. Stop watching. Go back to your cabin and stay there." "But you know something?" I insisted. "This whole expedition, it's not research, is it?" Richardson leaned forward, his voice barely audible. "Some questions are dangerous to ask. Some knowledge is dangerous to have. That's not an answer. It's the only one I can give you." He stood up. "I've known you since you were an undergraduate. Trust me when I tell you to let this go." He left without another word, leaving his lunch half-eaten. I returned to the observation deck after lunch, finding it now guarded by Mikhail, the security officer who had escorted me back to my cabin the night before. His cold stare made it clear I wasn't welcome, but there was no explicit rule against my presence in this part of the ship. I kept my distance, pretending interest in the horizon while actually watching the operation reflected in the windows. Hours passed with the net holding steady at its maximum depth. The Russians maintained radio silence, communicating only through hand signals or direct conversation. The anticipation among the crew was almost tangible. Late in the afternoon, I noticed a change. The men at the sonar station became animated, pointing repeatedly at their screens. Captain Petrov appeared, striding across the deck with purpose, his gaze fixed on the sonar readings. He studied them for several minutes, before giving orders that sent the crew into controlled but urgent action. I managed to slip away from Mikhail's watchful eye by pretending to head back to my quarters. Instead, I took a different route that led to a small maintenance corridor with a porthole overlooking the stern. From there, I had a partial view of the operation. Captain Petrov now personally oversaw the winch controls, checking his watch repeatedly. Additional crew members appeared, some carrying what looked like weapons wrapped in canvas. Others brought restraint equipment, heavy chains and metal brackets, and lined them up neatly on the deck. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the water. The atmosphere on the ship had shifted from focused concentration to tense expectation. These weren't the actions of scientists conducting random sampling. These were the precise movements of a team preparing to capture something specific and potentially dangerous. As twilight approached, Captain Petrov gave an order that sent his men scrambling to positions around the stern. Some manned the winches, while others stood ready with the restraint equipment. Everyone moved with practiced efficiency, suggesting they had trained for this exact scenario. I pressed myself against the cold glass of the porthole, watching the final preparations with a growing sense of dread. Whatever lay at the other end of those cables, thousands of feet below us in the darkening waters of the North Atlantic, the Russians had come prepared to find it, capture it, and control it. And based on the weaponry I glimpsed being unwrapped on deck, they expected it to fight back. The sky turned deep crimson as the sun slipped below the horizon. I remained pressed against the porthole in the maintenance corridor, my breath making small clouds on the cold glass. The Russian crew had taken positions around the stern, tension visible in their rigid postures. Captain Petrov raised his hand, then brought it down in a sharp cutting motion. At his signal, the massive winches roared to life. The thick cables went taut, vibrating with strain as they began to pull something heavy from the depths. I wiped the condensation from the glass with my sleeve, unwilling to miss anything. The winch operators moved with practiced efficiency, monitoring gauges and adjusting speeds with the precision of men who had done this before. Water churned at the stern as the enormous net began its ascent from 2,000 feet below. Whatever they were bringing up, it was fighting against the pull of the cables. The winches groaned under the strain, and twice I saw crew members rush to reinforce connections that threatened to snap. I needed a better view. This porthole showed only a fraction of the operation. Making a split-second decision, I abandoned my hiding spot and quietly made my way up a narrow utility ladder that led to an upper deck overlooking the stern. The security focus was entirely on the operation below. No one noticed as I crouched behind some ventilation equipment. Now, with an unobstructed view of everything, the water behind the ship began to glow. At first, I thought it must be some trick of the fading light. But the blue-green luminescence intensified as the net drew closer to the surface. The glow pulsed rhythmically like a massive heartbeat. 30 minutes into the hauling operation, the first sign of the net broke the surface. Reinforced mesh dripping with seawater, straining against something enormous struggling within. The Russian crew moved with greater urgency now, some backing away from the rail while others advanced with equipment I'd glimpsed earlier. The restraints and weapons. Then I saw it. The creature breached the surface in an explosion of water and bioluminescent fluid. My mind struggled to process what my eyes were seeing. A massive spiral shell, larger than any living thing I'd ever encountered, rose from the water. The shell alone measured at least 30 feet across, with a surface that reflected the ship's lights in iridescent patterns of blue, green, and purple. But it was the tentacles that turned my scientific wonder into primal fear. Thick as tree trunks, they whipped out from the central body cavity, extending another 20 feet beyond the shell. I counted 8 of them, each lined with suckers the size of dinner plates. The tentacles twisted and struck at everything within reach, searching for purchase, for something to grab. This was no random deep-sea specimen. I was looking at a living fossil, an ammonite of impossible size. These cephalopods had supposedly gone extinct alongside the dinosaurs. Yet here one was, very much alive and fighting for its freedom with terrifying intelligence and power. A shout from below drew my attention. One of the tentacles had found a target, a crewman working the winch controls. It wrapped around his torso in an instant and yanked him off the deck. His scream cut short as he was pulled over the rail and into the churning water. Before anyone could react, 2 more tentacles struck, each claiming another victim. 3 men gone in seconds. Captain Petrov bellowed commands in Russian, his voice cutting through the chaos. The remaining crew responded with military discipline that confirmed my suspicions. These weren't researchers. They were soldiers trained for this exact scenario. From compartments I hadn't noticed before, crew members produced weapons, automatic rifles, harpoon guns, and what looked like specialized grenades. They formed a firing line along the rail, while others continued working the winches, struggling to keep the creature contained in the net. The ammonite slammed a tentacle against the hull, creating a booming sound that resonated through the entire ship. The impact knocked several men off their feet and sent equipment sliding across the deck. Another tentacle grabbed a section of railing and crumpled it like aluminum foil. I should have been terrified. I should have run back to my cabin and hidden. Instead, I watched, transfixed by the battle between human technology and this ancient leviathan. My hands itched for my camera, for any way to document what I was seeing. The first volley of gunfire erupted from the deck, bullets tearing into the exposed flesh of the tentacles. The creature recoiled, emitting a high-pitched sound that was felt more than heard, a vibration that made my teeth ache and my stomach clench. The water around the ship frothed as the ammonite thrashed in pain and rage. A crew member lobbed one of the specialized grenades toward the main body of the creature. It detonated with a dull thump rather than an explosion, releasing a cloud of greenish gas that enveloped part of the ammonite. Where the gas touched, the creature's luminescence dimmed, and its movements became sluggish. Captain Petrov directed the attack from a position of relative safety, pointing to vulnerable areas and shouting commands. This was a coordinated assault, not a panicked response. They knew the creature's weaknesses, knew how to subdue it. But the ammonite wasn't surrendering without inflicting damage. Its dying rage was terrible to behold. A tentacle smashed into a crane mechanism, bending steel and sending hydraulic fluid spraying across the deck. Another strike tore loose a section of the stern railing and part of the net winch system. Metal screeched as it was twisted and torn from its moorings. Through it all, I remained hidden, watching with a mix of scientific fascination and moral horror. This was a living specimen of incalculable scientific value, possibly the last of its kind, and they were killing it without hesitation. The battle lasted 20 minutes. 20 minutes that rewrote everything I thought I knew about marine biology and evolutionary history. The creature's movements gradually weakened as more grenades released their chemical payload and bullets tore into its flesh. Its luminescence flickered like a failing light bulb, once brilliant blues and greens fading to dull pulses. With one final spasm that shook the entire ship, the ammonite went still. Its tentacles, which had been instruments of destruction moments before, hung limp over the sides of the net. The spiral shell, still breathtaking in its size and complexity, tilted slightly as water drained from its chambers. Dead. An evolutionary miracle, murdered before it could be studied properly. The deck fell silent, except for the sounds of water dripping from the net and quiet orders from Captain Petrov. The crew moved methodically now, securing the creature's body with additional cables and beginning the process of bringing it fully on board. Medical personnel tended to injured crew members while others repaired what damage they could to the equipment. I slipped away from my hiding place before someone thought to look up and spot me. Back in the maintenance corridor, I leaned against the wall, legs suddenly weak. My mind raced to process what I'd just witnessed. This wasn't some random discovery. The precision of the capture operation, the specialized equipment, the crew's training, everything pointed to a planned hunt for a known target. The Russians had come looking specifically for this creature. They knew it existed, knew where to find it, and came prepared to capture or kill it. The weeks of meaningless research tasks assigned to us American scientists had been nothing but cover for this operation. As I made my way back toward my cabin, keeping to shadows and avoiding the busy corridors, a cold realization settled over me. Dr. Richardson must have known, at least partially. His warning to stay in my cabin, his refusal to answer questions, he'd been protecting me from knowledge that was clearly dangerous to possess. Back in my cabin, I sat on the edge of my bunk, still processing what I'd seen. The creature represented a biological impossibility, a supposedly extinct species surviving in the deep ocean, grown to proportions that defied everything we understood about invertebrate physiology. Its existence should have been headline news in every scientific journal in the world. Instead, it had been killed in secret and was now being secured for transport to who knew where. The wonder of the discovery clashed with the brutality of its capture. That creature might have been the last of its kind, an evolutionary branch we thought long dead. Or worse, what if it wasn't the only one? What if there were more of these behemoths lurking in the deep waters of the North Atlantic? I lay back on my bunk, staring at the ceiling. The image of the massive ammonite burned into my memory, its spiral shell gleaming with bioluminescence, its tentacles moving with terrible purpose. A living fossil, a miracle of survival. Now dead on the deck of a Russian vessel disguised as a research ship. The realization that had been building since we left Murmansk finally crystallized. I was not on a scientific expedition. I was an unwitting accessory to something much darker, something governments wanted kept secret. Whatever came next, I knew with certainty that the creature now being secured on deck was the true purpose of our voyage into these cold, remote waters. I couldn't stay in my cabin, not with what was on the deck above me. My camera sat in my desk drawer where I'd left it since boarding the ship. I pulled it out, checking the battery level, half full. It would be enough. I tucked it into my jacket pocket and stepped into the corridor, listening for any movement. The ship hummed with activity, but most of it seemed concentrated on the deck where they were securing the ammonite. I took the long route up, avoiding the main stairwells where security would likely be posted. When I reached the upper deck, I stayed in the shadows, watching the operation unfold. The creature lay sprawled across the stern section, its massive spiral shell glistening under the deck lights. Even in death, it commanded a terrible majesty. The crew worked to secure the body with additional cables, their movements still carrying the wariness of men handling something dangerous. I circled to a position behind some equipment cases, raised my camera, and began shooting. Click. The first photo captured the full spiral shell from above. Click. The second focused on one of the tentacles, showing the dinner plate-sized suckers lined with serrated edges I hadn't noticed during the battle. Click. A close-up of the shell's surface, where patterns of bioluminescence still pulsed faintly, like dying stars. The detail on the shell was like nothing I'd ever seen, not in textbooks, museums, or research papers. Intricate ridges ran along the spiral chambers, creating a mathematical perfection that seemed almost artificial. The exterior wasn't just a simple spiral, but contained smaller, fractal-like patterns that repeated at different scales. And most remarkably, patches of what appeared to be specialized organs embedded in the shell wall still emitted a faint blue-green glow. I moved carefully around the perimeter, shooting from different angles. The creature's central body cavity, partially visible where the tentacles emerged, contained structures that defied easy classification, neither fully cephalopod nor anything else known to marine biology. I was on my 12th photo, focusing on what appeared to be sensory organs near the head region, when a rough hand grabbed my shoulder. "Camera, give now." Mikhail's voice was cold as the water surrounding us. I turned slowly, finding myself face to face with the security officer. 2 other guards stood behind him, hands resting on holstered sidearms. "I'm documenting a scientific specimen," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is an unprecedented discovery that needs to be—" Mikhail snatched the camera from my hands. "Not your job. No pictures." He checked the display, his face hardening as he scrolled through the images I'd taken. "That creature is a living fossil," I protested. "It could rewrite everything we know about marine evolutionary history." "Dead fossil now," Mikhail said flatly. "And classified. You go back to cabin. Now." He pocketed my camera and stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Lucky you not join crew in water. Stay away from deck. Stay away from specimen or consequences." His English was broken, but his meaning crystal clear. The 2 guards moved to flank me. One grabbed my arm, squeezing hard enough to leave bruises. The message wasn't subtle. I'd crossed a line and they were prepared to enforce it physically if necessary. "I understand," I said, recognizing the futility of resistance. "I'll go back to my cabin." Mikhail watched me with cold eyes. "Smart choice. Americans go home soon. Better to go in one piece." They escorted me back to my cabin, making sure I was locked inside. The moment they left, I went straight to my porthole. It offered a limited view of the rear deck, but enough to keep watching. Over the next hour, I observed the crew cover the creature with heavy tarps, then secure these with additional steel cables crisscrossed over the bulky form. Lights had been set up around the perimeter, allowing the work to continue through the night. The efficiency with which they handled the process suggested this wasn't the first time they'd transported something of this nature. I felt the ship's engines change pitch, then a subtle shift in our motion as we changed course. I grabbed the small emergency compass I kept in my bag, a habit from years of fieldwork, and confirmed we were now heading almost due east, a significant deviation from our previous northeastern trajectory. Sleep was impossible. I alternated between watching the activity on deck and checking our position against the navigation charts I'd brought along. By my calculations, we appeared to be heading toward the Svalbard archipelago, though our exact destination wasn't clear. The night passed in a blur of sporadic activity. Twice I saw Dr. Richardson on deck speaking with Captain Petrov, their conversation apparently tense based on their body language. Rebecca and Kevin were nowhere to be seen, presumably confined to quarters like me. When morning came, I was still at my porthole, stiff from hours in the same position. On the horizon, a dark shape emerged from the mist, an island rising from the cold North Atlantic waters. As we drew closer, details came into focus. This was no ordinary island. The natural rocky coastline had been reinforced with concrete seawalls. Watchtowers stood at regular intervals along the perimeter, and I spotted the distinctive shapes of radar installations and what looked like defensive weapon systems. A small harbor had been carved into the southern face, with a concrete dock extending out to deeper water. Military patrol boats circled our vessel as we approached, their crews watching our ship with practiced vigilance. This wasn't just a research facility. It was a fortress. A classified Russian research facility, I murmured to myself. Based on our position, we had to be near Svalbard, though this particular island didn't appear on any of my charts. Not surprising for a secret installation. A sharp knock on my door was followed by the gruff voice of a Russian sailor. "Stay in cabin. Orders." I didn't reply, but returned to the porthole to watch the docking procedure. Captain Petrov guided the ship alongside the massive concrete pier with practiced precision. The moment we were secured, dozens of personnel swarmed aboard, some in military uniforms, others in what appeared to be specialized hazard gear. The operation to transfer the creature proceeded with military efficiency. Massive cranes positioned themselves above the tarped form, while teams secured lifting harnesses at strategic points. Within an hour, they had the entire bundle, easily 30 tons of dead ammonite, suspended above the deck. The sight was surreal, this prehistoric behemoth, now reduced to anonymous cargo, swinging gently as the crane operators adjusted their controls. On the dock below, a large platform on treads waited to receive the creature. Beyond that, I could see the entrance to what appeared to be an underground facility built into the island itself. A massive doorway set into the rock face, large enough to accommodate the creature with room to spare. As I watched, the reality of the situation solidified in my mind. The specialized equipment, the fortified island, the military personnel. None of this had been assembled hastily. The Russians hadn't stumbled upon this creature by accident. They had known what they were looking for, known where to find it, and had all the infrastructure ready to receive it. This wasn't a one-time expedition. It was part of an ongoing program, a program significant enough to warrant a dedicated facility on a classified island with military-grade security and specialized transport systems. The creature disappeared into the underground entrance, swallowed by whatever facility waited below. The massive doors began to close behind it, sealing away one of the most significant biological discoveries in human history. I stepped back from the porthole, my mind racing with implications. Whatever the Russians were doing here went far beyond simple marine research. They were hunting, capturing, and studying creatures that shouldn't exist. Creatures that, until yesterday, I would have sworn were extinct for millions of years. And most disturbing of all, they clearly expected to find more. The ship pulled away from the mysterious island, its engines rumbling beneath my feet. I watched through my cabin porthole as the fortified facility receded into the distance, swallowed by mist and secrecy. The massive underground entrance that had consumed the ammonite's body was the last thing I saw before the island disappeared completely from view. I stayed in my cabin for the next 4 days as we traveled back to Murmansk. The door wasn't locked. It didn't need to be. Something inside me had locked up instead. I took my meals there, picking at whatever the Russian crew delivered 3 times daily. The food tasted like nothing. Everything tasted like nothing. When Kevin knocked on my door the second day, I didn't answer. Same with Rebecca on the third. Dr. Richardson came once, his voice low through the metal door, asking if I was all right. I lay on my bunk, staring at the ceiling, saying nothing until his footsteps faded down the corridor. What would I even tell them? That I'd seen a creature that shouldn't exist? That I'd watched it kill 3 men before being slaughtered itself? That I'd sneaked photos of a classified military operation? The weight of these secrets pressed against my chest like the deep ocean pressures that had shaped that impossible creature. My thoughts circled endlessly. The creature's bioluminescence, the precision of the Russian operation, the facility built into the island. None of this was accidental. None of this was a surprise to them. They had known exactly what they were hunting. By the 4th day, Murmansk appeared on the horizon, gray and unwelcoming under heavy clouds. I packed my few belongings mechanically, knowing I just needed to make it through whatever came next, then get on a plane home. Back to Miami, to sunshine and normality and life without massive extinct creatures pulled from impossible depths. The ship docked with practiced efficiency. I stood in my cabin, bag packed, waiting for whatever came next. Heavy boots echoed down the corridor, stopping outside my door. A sharp knock followed. "Ready for departure," a Russian voice announced. When I opened the door, 2 uniformed men stood waiting. Neither was from the ship's crew. Their uniforms bore insignia I didn't recognize, some branch of military or intelligence service. "David Martinez," one said. "Not a question. Come with us." In the narrow corridor outside the cabins, I saw similar scenes playing out. Dr. Richardson was being escorted by two different officials. Down the hall, Rebecca and Kevin were also being led away, each with their own escorts. None of us were allowed to speak or make eye contact. They marched me down the gangplank and directly into a black SUV with tinted windows parked on the dock. No customs check, no passport control. From the vehicle, I watched Richardson being placed in a separate car, followed by Rebecca and Kevin and two others. "Where are you taking us?" I asked the driver as we pulled away. He didn't answer. Neither did the guard sitting beside me. The drive took less than 15 minutes through the gray industrial landscape of Murmansk. We stopped at a concrete building set back from the road, unmarked except for a numeric code above the entrance. The guard escorted me inside, down a long hallway with doors on either side and into a room containing only a metal table bolted to the floor and 3 chairs. "Wait," he ordered, then left. The room was cold, not freezing, but chilled enough to keep me uncomfortable. No windows, 1 door, a camera in the upper corner, its red light steady and watchful. I sat in the chair facing the door, my hands on the table, trying to look calmer than I felt. 20 minutes passed before the door opened again. 2 people entered, a man and a woman, both in formal military dress. The man was in his 50s, with short gray hair and a face that might have been carved from the same granite as the building. The woman appeared younger, perhaps mid-40s, with dark hair pulled back severely from her face. Both carried folders. "David Martinez," the man said, consulting his folder. "I am Major Boris Kuznetsov. This is Colonel Elena Fedorova. We have some questions about your research voyage." They sat across from me, arranging their materials with careful precision. "Your colleagues are in similar conversations elsewhere in this building," Colonel Fedorova added, her English crisp and accented. "Your cooperation will determine how quickly you return home." Major Kuznetsov opened his folder. "Tell us about your activities aboard the RV Severny." I'd spent 4 days preparing for this moment. I was brought on as a marine biologist to analyze water samples and record current patterns. Most of the time I was in the lab or my cabin. The seas were rough. I got seasick a lot. "Seasick," Colonel Fedorova repeated, her tone making it clear she didn't believe me. "Yet you managed to take these." She slid several photographs across the table. My photographs. The ones Mikhail had confiscated when he caught me on deck. Clear images of the creature. Its spiral shell, its tentacles, the details of its alien biology. "I don't know what those are," I said, my mouth dry. Major Kuznetsov leaned forward. "Mr. Martinez, let me be clear. We know exactly what you saw. We know you were on the deck during the specimen retrieval. We know you took these photographs. Lying complicates matters." I looked down at the images, my scientific training still marveling at what they showed despite my fear. "It was an ammonite," I said quietly. "A living fossil, something that should have been extinct for millions of years." "It was nothing," Colonel Fedorova said flatly. "A routine marine research expedition found nothing of note. That is the official record." Major Kuznetsov placed a blank notepad and pen before me. "Write down everyone you have spoken to about what you observed. Include any communication since boarding the vessel." "No one," I said. "I haven't talked to anyone." "Not even your American colleagues?" Colonel Fedorova asked. "We were kept separate after that night. And before that, I didn't know what was happening." They exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. "The photographs," Major Kuznetsov said, gathering them from the table. He produced a metal wastebasket and placed it on the table between us. Then deliberately he took out a lighter and set the corner of the first photograph on fire. The image curled and blackened as he dropped it into the basket. One by one he burned each photograph while I watched. "No evidence exists," Colonel Fedorova said as the last photograph turned to ash. "No creature exists. Your expedition conducted routine deep-sea research, nothing more." The room smelled of burnt chemicals from the photographs. I watched the final embers die in the metal basket. There are protocols for situations like this, Major Kuznetsov continued. International agreements about certain discoveries. Things the public is not ready to know. Colonel Fedorova opened her folder and removed a document, sliding it across to me. This states that you participated in routine marine research in international waters. You observed no unusual specimens. You witnessed no military activities. You will not discuss classified technologies you may have observed aboard the Russian vessel. I stared at the document. It was several pages long, dense with legal language in both Russian and English. Sign it, Major Kuznetsov said. What if I don't? Colonel Fedorova's expression didn't change. There are still 3 American citizens in this building who would like to go home. Their situations depend partly on yours. The threat was clear. I picked up the pen. Read it first, Major Kuznetsov suggested. I tried, but the words swam before my eyes. Legal jargon about classified information, national security, international cooperation, paragraphs about penalties for disclosure. I signed where indicated on each page, not fully comprehending everything I was agreeing to, wanting only to be done with this nightmare. When I finished, Colonel Fedorova collected the document. Good. Now, understand this clearly. What you think you saw was nothing. A research vessel. Some interesting but ultimately mundane deep-sea specimens. This is what you will tell anyone who asks. And if someone asks specifically about unusual creatures, I asked. No one will, Major Kuznetsov said with absolute certainty. But if they did, you would not recall anything unusual. Perhaps you were below deck. Perhaps, as you said, you were seasick. They stood simultaneously, gathering their materials. Your flight to Miami departs at 8 this evening, Colonel Fedorova said. Your colleagues will be on separate flights to their respective destinations. This is standard procedure to avoid any appearance of coordination. You'll be taken to your hotel to collect your belongings, then to the airport, Major Kuznetsov added. Do not attempt to contact your colleagues before departure. They moved toward the door. Then Colonel Fedorova turned back. Mr. Martinez, you are young. You have a promising scientific career ahead of you. It would be unfortunate if international travel restrictions or professional concerns about your reliability were to limit that potential. The door closed behind them, leaving me alone with the smell of burnt photographs and the weight of unspoken threats. 4 hours later, I sat at my departure gate at Murmansk Airport, my passport stamped and my boarding pass in hand. I'd seen no sign of Richardson, Rebecca, or Kevin. The airport was nearly empty, just a few travelers and airline staff moving through the sterile corridors. On the plane, I took my window seat and watched ground crews in the gathering darkness. As we took off, I caught a distant glimpse of the port where the RV Severny was docked, now just a collection of lights along the waterfront. The cabin lights dimmed as we reached cruising altitude. Most passengers slept or watched movies on their screens. I stared out the window at the darkness below, thinking about what lay in those waters. One creature, one aberrant specimen. That's all it was, I told myself. A single ammonite that had somehow survived in the deep ocean while the rest of its kind perished millions of years ago. A fluke of evolution. A scientific curiosity that would remain hidden in some Russian laboratory. What other explanation made sense? If there were more, we would know. Something that size couldn't remain hidden in today's world of constant underwater exploration and monitoring. The Russian operation had been precise because they'd tracked this single specimen, not because they were routinely hunting such creatures. I repeated this to myself as we flew over the Atlantic. The same Atlantic that had yielded that impossible creature. One creature. An isolated incident. Nothing more. By the time we began our descent into New York for my connecting flight to Miami, I had almost convinced myself it was true. 7 years passed like water through my fingers, both too quickly and not quickly enough. I now had Senior Marine Researcher on my office door at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. My new business cards still felt strange when I handed them out, like they belonged to someone else, someone who hadn't seen what I had seen. Someone whose nightmares didn't feature enormous tentacles and bioluminescent spiral shells. My office overlooked the harbor, giving me a clear view of research vessels coming and going. It was a good position, earned through years of focused work and carefully published papers on deep-sea ecosystems. I'd built a respectable career by staying in safe waters, both literally and professionally. No controversial theories, no unexplained phenomena, nothing that might connect me to that expedition in the North Atlantic. I never spoke about what happened aboard the RV Severny. Not to colleagues, not to friends, not to the woman I'd dated for 8 months before she got tired of my reluctance to share anything personal. The Russian interrogators had made themselves clear, and the memory of their threats had faded less than I'd hoped. I was reviewing grant proposals when Dr. Howard Benson, the Institute's research director, knocked on my open door. "David, got a minute?" I waved him in, clearing space on my cluttered desk. "What's up?" He dropped a thick folder in front of me. "NSF just approved the North Atlantic Deep Sea Survey. Full funding, 3 weeks at sea, all the equipment we requested." I picked up the folder, flipping through budget allocations and equipment lists. "That's great news. When's the departure?" 3 weeks. We're sending the Atlantis." He studied me with a curious expression. "I was thinking you might want to lead this one." I froze, my fingers stopping mid-page. The coordinates listed in the mission brief were painfully familiar. Not exactly where the Russian vessel had been, but close. Too close. "Something wrong?" Howard asked. I forced a smile. "No, just surprised. I thought Larson was pushing for this project." "He was, but he's got that commitment at Scripps he can't get out of." Howard leaned against my desk. "This is right up your alley, David. Deep sea biodiversity, geological mapping. The team's already half assembled, that sonar specialist you liked, Kim, and Dr. Thompson from the Gulf Project." My mind raced through excuses to avoid the assignment, but each one raised more questions than it answered. Why would I turn down a perfectly aligned research opportunity? How would I explain my reluctance without revealing what I knew? "Sounds good," I heard myself say. "I'll take it." After Howard left, I stood at my window, staring at the harbor while my reflection stared back at me. What was I doing? Going back there was the last thing I wanted, but refusing would raise questions I couldn't answer. Besides, what were the odds of finding anything? The North Atlantic was vast. The Russians had clearly known exactly where to look. They'd had coordinates, specialized equipment, military support. Our expedition was genuine research, not a targeted hunt. We'd be mapping large areas, not focusing on that specific location. Still, as I read through the mission details, something cold settled in my stomach. The planned survey area overlapped with where I'd been 7 years ago. Not exactly the same spot, but close enough that our sonar might detect something. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. I threw myself into equipment specifications and research protocols, partly to ensure everything was perfect, partly to avoid thinking about what might happen. Our team came together smoothly. Dr. Sarah Thompson was a marine biologist who'd made a name for herself studying deep-sea adaptations. Robert Kim was our sonar specialist, arguably the best in the field. Jennifer Adams rounded out the core team as our geological survey expert. All three were exceptional scientists I'd worked with before on less extensive projects. On a bright May morning, we boarded the RV Atlantis at the Woods Hole dock. At 230 feet, she was significantly smaller than the Severny had been, but properly equipped for genuine scientific research rather than covert military operations. "Everything loaded?" I asked Robert as he supervised the installation of our primary sonar array. He nodded, patting the equipment with obvious affection. "This baby can map features 3,000 feet down with resolution good enough to spot a shopping cart. We'll see everything down there." That was exactly what I was afraid of. Our departure went smoothly. As Woods Hole disappeared behind us, I stood at the stern, watching the coastline recede. Unlike my last Atlantic voyage, this time I knew our exact destination, our precise mission, and had complete access to all ship systems and data. No armed guards, no restricted areas, no mysterious equipment. "Beautiful day to set sail," Sarah said, joining me at the railing. Her curly brown hair was pulled back in practical braids, and her eyes reflected the same enthusiasm I once had for open ocean research. "I can't wait to see what we find. The deep North Atlantic has so many undocumented ecosystems." "Let's hope we find something interesting," I said, trying to match her excitement while fighting the voice in my head that whispered, "Be careful what you wish for." The voyage north took 4 days. I spent most of it finalizing our survey grid with Jennifer and helping Robert calibrate the sonar systems. We worked well together, Sarah bringing biological expertise, Jennifer providing geological context, Robert handling the technical aspects, and me coordinating it all while contributing my knowledge of deep-sea ecosystems. If they noticed my growing tension as we approached our primary research area, they didn't mention it. I caught myself checking our position obsessively, comparing it to the mental map I'd kept of that other voyage 7 years before. On the 5th day, we reached our initial survey coordinates. The weather held clear but cold, with the North Atlantic stretching gray and featureless around us. Looking at the empty horizon, it was hard to believe anything extraordinary could exist below. "Sonar deployment in 20 minutes, Robert announced over the ship's comm system. I joined the team in our main laboratory as Robert powered up the advanced sonar array. Unlike the crude system I'd glimpsed on the Russian vessel, this was cutting-edge technology. Multiple frequencies, 3-dimensional mapping capabilities, and sensitivity that could distinguish between different types of marine life based on density and movement patterns. "Grid pattern established," Jennifer said, marking sections on our digital map. "We'll start with the eastern quadrant and work west." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral while checking the coordinates. We were starting approximately 40 miles east of where the Russian ship had made its capture. Close enough to detect something if there were more creatures in the area, but not directly over the same spot. "Beginning scan," Robert announced, his fingers dancing across his control panel. The main screen filled with the first sonar returns. A standard seafloor topology, mostly flat with some ridges and depressions. Depth readings showed we were over a section approximately 2,800 feet deep. "Pretty standard abyssal plain features," Jennifer commented, marking notable formations on her tablet. "Some evidence of ancient glacial scouring, but nothing unexpected." I found myself holding my breath with each new scan, only to exhale with relief when nothing unusual appeared. Hour after hour, the sonar revealed only typical deep-sea features, the occasional seamount, scattered debris, standard geological formations. "Lunch break?" Sarah suggested around noon. I shook my head. "You 3 go ahead. I'll keep an eye on things here." After they left, I adjusted our course slightly, moving us in a gradual arc that would bring us closer to where I remembered the Russian ship stopping. I told myself I was being thorough, ensuring comprehensive coverage. The truth was more complicated. I needed to know if there was anything there. I needed confirmation that what I'd seen had been a solitary specimen, not part of something larger. The afternoon progressed without incident. The team returned, refreshed, and we continued our methodical scanning. My tension began to ease as we covered more ground without detecting anything unusual. Perhaps I'd been worrying for nothing. Perhaps that creature had been a lone survivor of its kind, now gone forever to that secret Russian facility. It was nearly 1800 hours when Robert straightened in his chair. "Hold up. I've got something strange on the western edge of Grid 14. My heart rate instantly doubled. "What kind of strange?" He frowned at his display. "Multiple large objects on the seafloor, not matching typical geological patterns." His fingers adjusted settings. "They're stationary, but..." The density readings are off for rock formations, and the shapes are too regular, too similar to each other. Sarah moved to look over his shoulder. Shipwreck, maybe? Debris field? Too organic in composition, Robert replied. And look at the distribution pattern. They're spaced almost evenly across this section. Jennifer joined them at the console. Could be some kind of reef structure, though that would be unusual at this depth. I stayed rooted in place, a cold sensation spreading through my chest. Can you get a clearer image? Robert shook his head. Not without repositioning directly above them and doing a focused scan. How many objects are we talking about? I asked, dreading the answer. Hard to say from this angle. He studied the readings. At least a dozen large masses, each approximately 20 to 30 feet in diameter. There could be more beyond our current range. My mouth went dry. 20 to 30 feet in diameter, spiral shapes, evenly spaced across the seafloor. Should we reposition for a better look? Jennifer asked. All three turned to me, waiting for the decision. I stared at the sonar display, at the blurry shapes that looked horribly familiar. My mind flashed back to that massive creature fighting in the net, its tentacles claiming Russian sailors, its shell glistening with bioluminescence under the ship's lights. David? Sarah prompted. I swallowed hard. Yes, let's get directly above them and prepare the submersible probe. If these readings hold, we'll want visual confirmation. I'll notify the captain, Jennifer said, reaching for the comm system. As she arranged our repositioning, I moved to Robert's station, looking more carefully at the sonar display. The objects were unmistakable once you knew what to look for. Spiral formations, densely packed in a pattern that suggested not random placement but something intentional, something organized. What do you think they are? Robert asked quietly. I met his eyes briefly before looking back at the screen. I'm not sure yet. It was the first lie I'd told my team. I knew exactly what we were seeing. The question was no longer what they were, but how many existed, and what would happen when we got closer. The ship changed course, heading directly toward the anomalous readings. As we approached, the shapes on the sonar became more defined, more numerous, and my dread transformed into certainty. We weren't seeing one creature like the one the Russians had captured. We were seeing dozens, maybe hundreds. Let's prepare the submersible, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the fear building inside me. We need visual confirmation of what we're dealing with. Sarah nodded eagerly. I'll get the camera systems ready. This could be an entirely new ecosystem. If only she knew how right she was, and how terrifying that knowledge would soon become. Sleep was impossible. I spent the night in my small cabin staring at the ceiling, my mind cycling through the possibilities of what we might find in the morning. The sonar images were unmistakable, even if my team didn't yet understand what they were seeing. I knew. Those spiral formations, their size, their arrangement, they were ammonites, like the one I'd watched kill 3 men before being slaughtered itself. I was at the lab 2 hours before our scheduled start time, reviewing the sonar data again. With each pass through the readings, my certainty grew. The patterns matched exactly what I remembered from 7 years ago. The density, the distinctive spiral shape, the size range. Robert arrived first, coffee in hand, looking refreshed despite yesterday's long hours. "You're up early," he said, dropping into his chair. "Couldn't wait to get started." "Something like that," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "How's the submersible prep coming?" "All green. Sarah's doing final checks on the camera systems now. We should be ready for deployment in about an hour." Jennifer came in next, followed shortly by Sarah. Their excitement was palpable, filling the room with an energy that contrasted sharply with the dread building inside me. They saw a scientific discovery. I saw a nightmare returning. "Weather conditions are perfect," Jennifer reported. "Minimal surface current. Good visibility. Couldn't ask for better conditions for the probe launch." "Let's get it in the water," I said. We moved to the stern launch bay where our remote-operated submersible waited. The ROV was roughly the size of a small car, bristling with cameras, lights, and sampling equipment. Unlike manned submersibles, it could descend to extreme depths without risk to human life. Its primary camera fed directly to our lab monitors, with 4 secondary cameras providing alternative angles. "Final systems check," Robert called out, running through his pre-launch protocol. Sarah stood beside me as the crew prepared to lower the submersible into the water. "This could be the biggest discovery of our careers," she said, her eyes bright with anticipation. "If these are biological formations rather than geological ones." I nodded but said nothing. What could I say? That I already knew what waited nearly 3,000 feet below us? That I'd seen one of these creatures up close, watched it fight with terrifying intelligence and strength? The submersible hit the water with barely a splash, its buoyancy systems automatically adjusting as Robert took control from his station in the lab. We all returned inside to watch the descent. "Beginning dive sequence," Robert announced as the submersible's lights came on, illuminating the first few meters of water. "All systems functioning normally." The lab fell quiet as we watched the depth counter tick upward on the main display. 100 feet, 500, 1,000. The water darkened around the submersible, turning midnight blue and then black, with only our powerful lights cutting through the darkness. 2,000 feet, Robert reported, approaching target depth. I felt sweat beading on my forehead despite the cool temperature in the lab. My hands gripped the edge of the console as I leaned forward, eyes fixed on the main screen. 2,500 feet. Sonar is picking up the formations directly below us now. Sarah stood beside me, her scientific excitement a stark contrast to my tension. Jennifer was taking notes, occasionally glancing at the geological readouts from the submersible's instruments. 2,800 feet, Robert said. Leveling out, activating all camera systems and bringing lights to full power. The submersible's powerful LED arrays illuminated the seafloor below, and the main screen filled with an image that stopped my breath. They were everywhere. Massive spiral shells scattered across the ocean floor like ancient monuments. Some lay half buried in sediment, others perched on rocky outcroppings. The smallest might have been 15 feet across, the largest easily stretched beyond 50 feet in diameter. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, leaning closer to the screen. "Are those shells?" Robert's fingers flew across his controls, adjusting the camera angles and light distribution. I've never seen anything like this, the size alone. "They're ammonites," I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. "Cephalopods, like nautilus or squid, but extinct. They shouldn't exist anymore." "Ammonites?" Jennifer looked at me sharply. "David, these are enormous. The fossil record doesn't show anything near this size." I didn't respond, my attention fixed on the screen as Robert maneuvered the submersible closer to one of the massive shells. Its surface was ridged with mathematical precision, spiral chambers expanding outward from a central point. The shell's exterior wasn't uniform in color. Patches of bioluminescent tissue were embedded throughout, currently dim but occasionally pulsing with faint blue-green light. "They're alive," Sarah breathed, pointing to a different area of the screen. "Look." From the opening of one shell, a massive tentacle slowly extended, then contracted again. The movement was languid, almost like the creature was stretching in its sleep. "Adjusting position for better visibility," Robert said, his voice steady despite the extraordinary scene before us. The submersible moved laterally, providing a view across a broader section of the seafloor. What had seemed like dozens of creatures in our initial glimpse revealed itself to be hundreds. They stretched beyond the range of our lights, an underwater city of colossal, spiral-shelled beings. "I'm counting at least 300 individuals in visual range," Jennifer said, marking locations on her tablet. "And sonar indicates the colony extends well beyond what we can see." "Colony?" Sarah repeated, her scientific mind already categorizing. Yes, that's exactly what this is. A colony of living fossils. But how? How could creatures this size exist without detection until now? I knew the answer, of course. They had been detected, by the Russians at minimum, perhaps by others. But that knowledge had been buried, classified, hidden away from the scientific community and the public. Robert expanded our view, sending the submersible on a careful path above the colony. The spatial arrangement isn't random, he noted. Look at the distribution pattern. There's almost a geometric precision to it. He was right. The creatures weren't randomly scattered but positioned in what appeared to be deliberate formations across the seafloor. Smaller individuals clustered around larger ones. Some areas contained shells of similar sizes grouped together. It suggested organization, purpose, intelligence. We need to document everything, Sarah said, already typing notes into her computer. These creatures shouldn't exist. They're supposed to have gone extinct with the dinosaurs. Let's get closer to one of the active ones, I suggested, pointing to a section where several tentacles were visible extending from shell openings. Robert nodded and guided the submersible toward a massive specimen near the center of our visual field. As we approached, I found myself holding my breath. The creature was easily as large as the one I'd seen captured, perhaps larger. Its shell measured at least 45 feet across, according to the submersible's laser measuring system. Careful, I cautioned, as Robert brought us within 20 feet of the shell opening. Don't get too close. They don't seem aggressive, Sarah noted. More like they're in some kind of dormant state. As if responding to her words, a tentacle emerged from the shell, thick as a tree trunk, lined with dinner plate-sized suckers, exactly like the ones I remembered. It extended lazily into the water, seeming to taste the currents. Then slowly, it turned toward our submersible. Back up, I said sharply. Move away now. Robert glanced at me, surprised by my tone, but complied, guiding the submersible backward several meters. The tentacle remained extended, waving gently in the direction our lights had illuminated. After a few moments, it retreated back into the shell. It sensed us, Sarah said, fascination clear in her voice. The light, the vibrations from our engines, or maybe electrical fields, these creatures have sensory capabilities. Jennifer, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, what can you tell from the surrounding geology? How long have they been here? She consulted her readings, brow furrowed in concentration. The seafloor around them shows significant adaptation to their presence. Sediment patterns suggest these formations have been stable for centuries, at minimum, possibly millennia. Millennia, Sarah repeated, a colony of prehistoric creatures living right under our scientific noses all this time. Robert continued to guide the submersible in a careful survey pattern, documenting each creature we passed. I'm noticing structural differences between individuals, he reported. Look at the shell ridging patterns. They're unique to each specimen, like fingerprints. On screen, the camera focused on the shell surface of a particularly large individual. Unlike fossilized ammonites I'd studied in textbooks, these living specimens had evolved features clearly adapted for deep-sea life. Specialized organs embedded in the shell wall produced the bioluminescence we were seeing. Sensory filaments extended from specific points along the shell, presumably detecting changes in the water. The nervous system development must be extraordinary, Sarah said, leaning toward the screen. Look at the coordinated tentacle movements. And see those structures near what would be the head region? Those appear to be advanced sensory organs. I remained silent, watching the creatures through new eyes. 7 years ago, I'd seen one individual in its death throes, fighting against capture. Now I was seeing them in their natural habitat, hundreds of them, living in what appeared to be a complex social arrangement. Can we get a count on the total colony size? I asked Robert. He adjusted the sonar display. Based on density readings similar to what we're seeing visually, I'd estimate between 800 and 1,000 individuals within a 12 square mile area. 1,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. If one creature had nearly destroyed a Russian military vessel, what could 1,000 do if they ever decided to rise toward the surface? Their metabolic rate must be incredibly slow, Sarah was saying, her scientific mind racing ahead. To sustain organisms this size at this depth with limited food sources, they must have evolved extremely efficient energy usage. Or they hunt, I said quietly. Sarah looked at me. What? Nothing, I replied. Just thinking about potential feeding behaviors. We spent the next 4 hours documenting the colony, moving the submersible carefully through different sections. Robert created a detailed map of the colony's layout, while Sarah cataloged biological observations, and Jennifer analyzed geological features that might explain how the creatures had remained hidden for so long. As the day progressed, my initial shock gave way to a deeper, more reasoned fear. These weren't just biological curiosities. They were intelligent predators with proven capacity for violence when threatened, and they existed in numbers far greater than I could have imagined. We should send a preliminary report to Woods Hole, Sarah suggested as we completed our initial survey. This discovery changes everything we know about evolutionary extinction events and deep-sea ecosystems. Let's wait, I said quickly. We need to review our data first, make sure we have everything properly documented before we make any announcements. She gave me a curious look. David, this is exactly the kind of discovery that needs immediate reporting. Woods Hole will want to organize follow-up expeditions, bring in specialists. I know, I said, trying to sound reasonable. But we need to be thorough. Let's take tonight to organize our findings and prepare a comprehensive initial report. I could see the others exchanging glances, likely confused by my reluctance, but they didn't push the issue. As Robert began the submersible's ascent, I watched the colony recede from view. Even without our lights, some of the creature's bioluminescence remained visible, a field of faint, pulsing blue-green lights scattered across the dark seafloor. What are they waiting for? Jennifer asked softly beside me. I turned to her. What do you mean? Their positioning, their dormant state. It's almost like... She paused, searching for words. Like they're waiting for something. A chill ran through me at her observation. She was right. There was something expectant about the colony, hundreds of ancient creatures, mostly dormant, arranged in patterns across the seafloor. The submersible broke the surface an hour later, and we retrieved it without incident. My team was buzzing with excitement as we transferred the data to our main systems, each of them already planning how to analyze their section of our discovery. I retreated to the ship's bow, needing a moment alone. The North Atlantic stretched gray and featureless around us, giving no hint of what lay beneath. Nearly 3,000 feet below where I stood, an ancient species that should have been extinct for millions of years lived in organized colonies. Not one aberrant specimen, as I'd tried to convince myself, but hundreds, perhaps thousands. And the Russians knew. They had come specifically hunting these creatures 7 years ago, equipped with specialized capture equipment and weapons designed for something they expected to fight back, which meant they knew the creatures existed before that expedition. How long had governments been aware? How many other colonies were there in the world's oceans? Most terrifying of all was the question no one had asked yet. What would happen if these creatures decided to rise? 3 days passed in a blur of activity after our discovery. I moved through them like a man sleepwalking, going through the motions of scientific documentation, while my mind raced with memories of tentacles claiming Russian sailors and military precision capturing a creature that shouldn't exist. The Atlantis remained positioned directly above the colony while my team worked with relentless enthusiasm. I'd never seen them so energized, and it terrified me. I've mapped another section extending northwest, Robert told me on the morning after our discovery. pointing to his expanded sonar grid. The distribution pattern maintains that same geometric spacing we noticed yesterday. I leaned over his shoulder, staring at the display. The colony was enormous, far larger than I'd initially feared. How far does it extend? Based on current readings, approximately 12 square miles. Robert adjusted a setting, bringing up a three-dimensional model. I've confirmed at least 800 distinct individuals, but there are likely more in areas where our sonar has difficulty penetrating the seafloor terrain. 800 creatures, each capable of what I'd witnessed 7 years ago. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but my stomach twisted with dread. That's comprehensive work, Robert. This is just the beginning, he said, eyes bright with excitement. Once we get back to Woods Hole with this data, we'll need to organize a much larger expedition. Multiple ships, better equipment. This colony could rewrite everything we know about evolutionary biology. I nodded mechanically and moved to check on Sarah, who had converted part of the lab into an impromptu biological analysis station. She barely looked up when I approached, too focused on the footage playing on her screen, a close-up of tentacle movement from one of the larger specimens. These suckers have a unique serrated edge structure, she said, pointing to the screen. Nothing like modern cephalopods, and look at the neural response time. The tentacle on screen withdrew rapidly when the submersible's lights intensified, showing coordination that suggested advanced nervous system development. They seem intelligent, I offered, my voice carefully neutral. More than seem, Sarah replied, finally looking up at me with excitement. Their brain-to-body ratio appears comparable to modern octopi, which are already remarkably intelligent. But the colony behavior suggests something beyond individual intelligence. Possible communication between specimens, coordinated positioning. She turned back to her computer and pulled up a document that made my heart skip. It was titled, Preliminary Report, Discovery of Living Ammonite Colony. I've drafted our initial findings for Woods Hole, she explained. Once I finish the biological assessment section, we should transmit this immediately. The scientific community needs to know about this discovery as soon as possible. I swallowed hard. Let's be thorough before we send anything official. We need to be absolutely certain about our observations. Sarah gave me a curious look. David, this is the biggest discovery of our careers, possibly of the century. Woods Hole will want to know right away so they can start organizing follow-up resources. I know, I said, trying to sound reasonable. Just let's complete all our analyses first. She nodded slowly, clearly confused by my hesitation, but willing to trust my judgment as team leader. Jennifer was equally immersed in her work, analyzing core samples we'd collected from the seafloor near the colony. When I checked on her progress that afternoon, she showed me sediment layering that confirmed what I already feared. These creatures have been here for an extremely long time, she explained, pointing to distinct layers in the sample. Based on sedimentation rates and carbon dating, I'd estimate this colony has been stable for at least 700 years, possibly much longer. 700 years, I repeated. Right here in the North Atlantic, completely undiscovered. Jennifer gave me a searching look. That's what's strangest about all this. These aren't small organisms hiding in some remote trench. They're massive creatures in an area that's been mapped and explored. How have they remained undetected all this time? I looked away, unable to meet her eyes. They hadn't remained undetected. The Russians knew. Who else did? The second day brought more revelations as Robert extended our sonar mapping to the colony's outer edges. Jennifer continued her geological analysis, and Sarah spent hours documenting the creature's biological characteristics based on our submersible footage. I participated in their work, offering observations and guidance while fighting the growing panic inside me. Each new discovery only confirmed what I already knew. These creatures were ancient, intelligent, and potentially deadly if disturbed. By the third day, Sarah had completed her preliminary report, Robert had finalized his colony mapping, and Jennifer had established a geological timeline for the colony's existence. They gathered in the main lab that afternoon, their excitement palpable as they shared their findings. "I believe we're ready to transmit our initial report to Woods Hole," Sarah announced. "I've included all our preliminary findings and the full video documentation." Robert nodded in agreement. "My mapping data shows the complete colony structure. It's remarkable, almost like an underwater city." "My geological analysis supports that these creatures have maintained this location for centuries," Jennifer added. "The seafloor has adapted to their presence in ways that suggest long-term stability." They all looked at me expectantly, waiting for my approval to send the report. I stood frozen, knowing what would happen once that information reached Woods Hole. More ships, more people. Eventually, military involvement. History repeating itself. "I think we should also include a proposal for an immediate follow-up expedition," Sarah continued, misinterpreting my silence as thoughtful consideration. "We'll need larger vessels, more specialized equipment." "Including capture systems," Robert added. "If we could bring even a small specimen to the surface for direct study." The words hit me like a physical blow. Capture systems. The image of that massive net, the specialized winches, the armed Russians waiting on deck flashed through my mind. "No," I said, more forcefully than I intended. "No capture attempts." They all stared at me, surprised by my sudden vehemence. "David, I understand the ethical considerations," Sarah said carefully, "but obtaining a specimen would be invaluable for—" "You don't understand." I took a deep breath, knowing the moment had arrived. I couldn't delay any longer. "We can't send this report, not yet." "What?" Robert looked completely confused. Why would we delay reporting the biggest scientific discovery of our careers? I moved to the lab door and closed it, then turned back to face my team. "Because these creatures have been discovered before, and capturing one didn't go well." Silence fell over the room as they processed my words. Sarah was the first to speak. "What do you mean it discovered before? There's no record of—" "There wouldn't be," I interrupted. "It was classified, hidden, covered up." I paused, looking at each of them in turn. "I know because I was there." I pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, suddenly exhausted by the weight of the secret I'd carried for 7 years. 7 years ago, I participated in what was presented to me as a joint American-Russian research expedition to the North Atlantic. It was led by my former thesis advisor, Dr. Thomas Richardson. "I remember that expedition," Jennifer said slowly. "You never published anything from it." "Because there was nothing to publish," I replied. "At least nothing I was allowed to share." I took another deep breath. The expedition wasn't scientific research. It was a military operation disguised as research. The Russians knew exactly what they were looking for. I told them everything: the secretive voyage aboard the RV Severny, the restricted areas, the weapons hidden under tarps. I described the night they'd stopped suddenly and changed course, the massive net they'd deployed to nearly 2,000 feet, and the specialized equipment designed for a specific target. "They captured one," I said, my voice growing hoarse with the telling. "A single ammonite, almost identical to the ones we've been observing. It fought back, killed 3 men before they brought it down with specialized weapons and chemicals." My team sat in stunned silence as I described the creature's desperate battle, its intelligence and power, and its eventual slaughter on the deck of the Russian vessel. "They took it to a fortified facility built into an island near Svalbard," I continued, "a place that doesn't exist on any chart. Everything about it screamed long-term operation, specialized equipment, military personnel, infrastructure designed specifically for these creatures." "Why didn't you ever report this?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because when we returned to Murmansk, I was separated from the others and interrogated by Russian military intelligence. They had my photographs, knew everything I'd seen. They made it very clear what would happen if I ever spoke about it." I rubbed my face. the memory of that cold interrogation room still vivid. I signed documents under duress. They threatened my career, my freedom, possibly worse. But that was 7 years ago, Robert said. Why tell us now? Because I can't let it happen again. I gestured toward his sonar display showing hundreds of creatures. What we've found isn't just a scientific curiosity. It's potentially an existential threat. I explained my reasoning, how a single creature had nearly destroyed a heavily armed Russian vessel, how it had killed trained military personnel in seconds. What could hundreds or thousands do if provoked? The moment we send that report, this stops being our discovery, I told them. Military interests will take over. They'll want to capture specimens, study them, possibly weaponize them. And if something goes wrong, if these creatures perceive a threat and respond collectively, the consequences could be catastrophic. The lab fell silent again as they absorbed what I'd told them. Sarah was the first to break the silence. You've carried this for 7 years, she said quietly. That must have been... I can't imagine. Why risk telling us now? Jennifer asked. You're violating whatever agreements they forced you to sign. They could come after you. Because you deserve to know. Because the world deserves warning. I looked at each of them in turn. But we need to be careful about how we proceed. If we rush this, if we let the wrong people take control of the information, we could trigger exactly what I'm afraid of. Robert leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. So what do we do? Pretend we didn't find anything? That's not an option either. No, I agreed. But we need to control how this information reaches the scientific community and the public. We need to present it in a way that emphasizes caution, that makes clear these creatures must be studied from a distance, not captured or disturbed. We need time to think about this, Sarah said, looking at the others, to decide the right approach. I'll delete the transmission I was preparing, she added after a moment. Until we figure this out together. Thank you, I said, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. All of you. We spent the rest of the evening talking through options, weighing different approaches to sharing our discovery while mitigating the risks. No definitive plan emerged, but the fact that my team believed me, that they were taking the threat seriously, gave me hope. As we prepared to head back to Woods Hole the following morning, I stood at the ship's bow watching the sun rise over the North Atlantic. The water looked peaceful, ordinary, giving no hint of what lay beneath. 7 years of silence had ended. I'd finally shared the truth with people I trusted, broken free from the isolation imposed by what I'd witnessed. Whatever consequences came from that decision, I would face them knowing I'd done what I believed was right. The water stretched endlessly before us as the Atlantis turned south toward home. Somewhere far below, ancient creatures waited in their spiral shells. The Russian military knew about them. Now we did too. The question that haunted me as we sailed away wasn't whether the truth would eventually reach the wider world. It was what humanity would do with that truth when it did.